Today, we're going to talk about what the new Sunset meta will be, because of course, Sunset is rotating in for Fracture. So let's dive in. And first, we're going to take a look at what the meta was last year. So here is the top 10 most picked agents on Sunset from 2024. Obviously, Omen, absolutely, almost every single team comp played Omen. Then a ton of Cypher, a ton of Raze. Then we start to get into what I'll call the Initiator debate, right? Which was kind of the main debate on Sunset between the next four of Sova, Breach, Gecko, or KO. And really, we saw, all sorts of combinations of, Sova, Breach, Sova, KO, Gecko, Breach, Gecko, KO, right? Like all of the different combinations were kind of all played for the most part at some point. And I expect as we go forward that might be a bit similar. But then we had Neon at 22%, obviously rising a lot after the Neon buffs came in. Viper surprisingly at 20%, but a lot of that was in the early part of the year after coming off 2023, which of course was dominated by Viper. So I wouldn't expect it to be as high as it was. And then we had Fade at 11%. So that was last year, but now we're going to go through each of the classes and, talk about where we are right now and what we might expect for 2025. Starting with perhaps the most easy one, the controller class, which is going to be completely dominated by Omen. Now, there is a tiny bit of Viper here. As I said, Viper was at 20%. Would it shock me if someone tried Viper? No, right? We might see a couple Vipers here and there, but of course, for the most part, it is probably going to be solo controller, and it is probably going to be almost always Omen. Next up, we have a much more interesting class, which is the Jewelist class, which really I think can be split into three different sections in terms of Raze, Neon, and Yoru. Now, I've actually put Neon as the favorite right now, and that's for a couple reasons. In general, obviously, we're coming off the back of the Teo meta, and Raze's pick rate on the whole has seen a bit of a dip, right? And I think that Sunset, obviously, we saw many teams, obviously Team Heretics being an obvious one, but EDG as well, of course, Champs, really using the Neon, and yeah, that was the the buff Neon, the crazy Neon for some of the year, but I do still think that Neon has shown, for instance on maps like Fracture, that Neon is still a pretty decent pick overall, and so I still think that Neon on Sunset will be a pretty big force in general, and it might be closer to 50-50. Obviously we saw a lot of Raze last year, but again, that was before, the Neon buff came into effect, some of that data. So I do think that Neon has a chance to be the most picked duelist on Sunset. But Raze, of course, still will be a, fairly popular choice, I'm sure, with some teams. And, it wouldn't be a surprise to see some Raze in there. But, of course, the new agent that you're going to see now is Yoru, right? Just across the board, I think most people would probably agree with the statement that Yoru is the best duelist in the game. And so it just wouldn't shock you to see, Yoru getting played on Sunset, because Yoru is getting played on, most other maps in general. And yeah, Yoru synergized well with the Teo meta, but Yoru is just good in general, full stop, right? No matter what the meta, I think most people have just come to realize that this agent is very strong. And now that people are getting better at using Yoru, more and more teams have lent into it. Now, what's interesting about Yoru coming into the meta as well is that we have seen, on maps like maybe Lotus and Split as well, where double duelist, has become more popular this year than maybe it has been in the past, right? You think of Paper X's Lotus with Yoru Raze. We've seen some Yoru Neon comps on maps like Pearl as well, right? So there could be possibilities here of double duelist comps making it in to Sunset somewhat. That wouldn't shock me, whether that is Yoru Raze or Yoru Neon. I do think that there might be some space for that, and you might see some experimentation from, some teams that think that that will be the best solution for them. Now, I have also here, just put a tiny little ISO on this right-hand side, because again, could there be maybe like a Yoru ISO kind of, Haven-esque comp that someone wants to try? It wouldn't shock me, particularly if you have, someone who you think, ISO is going to enable them to just take over the game. Like, that to me wouldn't necessarily be the biggest shock in the world either. It's not a direction I think a lot of people will lean in, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone tried it. Moving on now to the Sentinel class, which, as we saw last year in 2024, was just completely dominated by Cypher. However, now, I do think there is going to be quite a few more possibilities coming out, right? Obviously, I still expect Cypher to be probably the most picked Sentinel overall. It's what people are familiar with, particularly early on. It's what people are familiar with, and Cypher's still very, very strong, right? So there's no reason really not to pick Cypher necessarily, but I do think obviously with the introduction of Vice that we have never seen on Sunset before, the Vice, you could you could see Vice working pretty decently well on a map like Sunset, right? Like, it seems like, you know, the Thorns would be good in quite a few different areas. The Wall is obviously just a very good ability in general. And, you know, particularly if it is a Neon map, right? Vice does pretty well against Neon in terms of, you know, the Thorns slowing down a Neon and the Wall being, you know, something that Neon teams have to, you know, be very careful about baiting out as well. So I do think that Vice also could see, you know, a pretty fairly significant pick rate on Sunset as well, because Vice seems like a good option. And then kind of furthering on from that, of course, again, something that particularly without Teo being in the meta now, I think that we are opening it up a lot more to, hey, you don't have to play double Initiator, particularly with Yoru kind of, you know, being meta and potentially doubling up as both, you know, some initiation and, you know, giving you some of the dive that you might want as well. You know, that you don't necessarily, you know, have to play double Initiator. And I think that that could open up a space for agents like Deadlock, who, of course, you know, got buffed. And again, Sunset is a map where you look at it and you think, like, you know, there's quite some tight spaces in there that a Gravnet could really destroy quite a lot of people in certain areas, right? The Wall, you know, is going to be pretty good. And even recently with teams like BBL, we've seen, you know, them cooking with the Sonic Sensors. You can get some surprise value from it. You know, that could be the case, particularly early on a map like Sunset as well. And so it wouldn't shock me, and we have seen this again on other maps like Pearl, like Split as well, where teams have tried double Sentinel. And maybe this is a map for that, and Deadlock could shine. And maybe even you think of Sunset as a map where, you know, could you even forego a kind of information Sentinel and just play Deadlock, right? And kind of say, well, we'll just shut the door in mid, and that'll give us a bit of information if they destroy it or not, right? We're gonna, particularly against like Neon teams who might just try and run it down, or double Jewelist teams who might just try and run it down, right? Like, maybe you don't need all that much, you know, information if they're just going to run it down, and you prefer the stopping power of someone like Deadlock, right? Maybe that's a choice as well. So we could even see that, but I do think that double Sentinel is a possibility. We've seen teams like Paper X do that, and that brings me on to my next point, which is Sage. Because Sage just missed out on the cutoff of the most picked agent, so of course we saw Paper X play Sage and do a lot of kind of cool, interesting stuff with the Sage, and again, like, would it shock me if, you know, a team like Paper X or someone copying them was like, well, let's just pick Sage because it worked last time, so let's just try it again? No, it wouldn't, right? And again, we could see some Sage on a map like Sunset, and even Chamber as well, right? I think that, again, we've seen some double Senti with Chamber on maps like Pearl, and again, maybe it's even solo Chamber, again, thinking that you don't need that much information, right? You could put the trip, you know, in terms of like top mid and then shut the door and have Chamber, you know, be you know, TPing in and getting aggressive in places. We have kind of seen that a little bit before. It wouldn't shock me if it happened again, and Chamber could be, you know, a somewhat viable option. And then finally, let's move on to the Initiators. And when it comes to the Initiators, had Teo not been nerfed, this would have been a slam dunk. Teo Breach, sending it all the time, no problem, right? However, with Teo getting nerfed, we've kind of gone back to 2024, I think, where you're going to get this, where you've got the 4 main Initiators that you're going to see, and people are going to chop and change them about, right, in their different pair combinations. That is what I would expect for the most part. But as I have been saying, there is perhaps more opportunities now than there have been in the past of not playing double Initiator and playing, you know, other stuff instead. Now, if that is the case, obviously it depends on exactly which kind of variant you're playing, but I would expect Sova or Fade, right, one of the 2 Recon Initiators, to be kind of the ones that are most played in those comps, right? Kind of, you're going Yoru, let's say we're playing double Senti, right? So you're playing like Yoru, you know, double Senti, Omen, and then you probably want like Sova or Fade to be kind of, you know, that last choice to kind of fill out the comp and give you that information that you might need, right? You could see like double Jewelist with Breach maybe or something like that, but I would expect maybe Sova would be the most popular choice in terms of those kind of comps, just looking at what we've seen perhaps on some of the other maps as well. But if double Initiator, which I still would expect to be the majority, I still think that would be the most played kind of archetype overall, we really are just going to get kind of the same mix and shuffle that we saw last year, right? Where some teams are playing Sova KO, some are playing Gecko KO, some are playing Breach Sova, right? Some are playing Breach Gecko, right? Like there's a ton of different combinations you can do, and all of them had, interestingly enough, like a fairly similar win rate versus each other. There was no clear winner last year, and so I would expect that to kind of just keep continuing playing out again. And so that is a quick look ahead to what the Sunset meta might hold. I really do hope that we get the different archetypes and not just double Initiator dominating, because if we do, then this really could be a very interesting map where, as you can kind of see, a lot of potential agents are maybe viable, and you could get a very interesting and varied meta of some very different team comps going up against each other.